This this week, I wanted to talk about Zionism, and that is a big controversy in Jewish history, and still is. It's one of the ongoing. It's not really a historical controversy. It's an ongoing one, but there is a lot of history that can help it. I mean, we see this today. I mean, just look at what's happening in Israel. And I would say in many ways, Zionism has won the battle, if you want to think of it that way, that we're going to, but there's still a lot of tension. And that tension comes from the fact that Jews have always lived around the world. We've always been both a people with a homeland, but also a diaspora people. That's part of, except for a brief period of time, supposedly it's sort of a mythical age of King David and King Solomon, you know, the United Kingdom, when, you know, the Southern Kingdom and the Northern Kingdom existed together. Throughout all of our history, we have had many people that lived outside of the land, and yet we have a homeland. So there's a tension built into Judaism from the start. And even biblically, I mean, God makes a promise to Abraham that he will arrive in the promised land and have children, and his children will be as numerous as the stars of the sea. But one, God makes this promise while Abraham is in Mesopotamia. Abraham's not even in Israel when God makes this promise. And secondly, by the time Abraham dies, he's all he's got is a cave, the cave of Machpelah, you know, where he buries Sarah, and he's got a son, Isaac, who, you know, is not the most productive son, if you know what I mean. I mean, Isaac's got a lot of problems, and yet Abraham is promised this incredible thing, but when he dies, it's not even close to being fulfilled. So we've always had this tension between life in Israel and life in the diaspora. Now, Zionism, as sort of defined as a movement, as an ideology, is really an old new movement. By old new, I say Zionism, the idea is that Jews have a home in the land of Israel, the biblical land of Israel. It's an old movement in that is one of the constant themes of Torah. The entire Torah is a journey towards the promised land. It is a new movement, which is what we're going to be focusing on mainly. It's new in that modern Zionism comes in the 19th century. And the 19th century is a time when a lot of places in Europe and Eastern Europe are becoming nation states. Remember, for most of history, Europe was sort of ruled by the church. Remember, the Holy Roman Empire is parts of Western and Central Europe. And then you've got the Ottoman Empire. And then, you know, it weakens and you have the Protestant Revolution. But then many of the countries in Europe are essentially like Germany is Lutheran and Holland is Dutch Calvinist. You know, so you have essentially religious states that govern Europe. But, and then there's little principalities, but then in the 19th century, you start to get these nationalist movements for unification of Germany, unification of Italy. You have the French Revolution in 1789, which cuts off a lot of the power of the aristocracy. Britain's a little more gradual, but you have the Glorious Revolution in 1688. You have gradual centralization of power in nation states. And Jews feel that same desire. Now, why is that? But now that I sort of set this context, let's go back in time. So in 70 CE, the temple is destroyed in Jerusalem by the Romans. At that time, the largest concentration of Jews lived in the land of Israel. However, it wasn't a majority of Jews. It was a plurality. So let's say, I don't know the exact statistics, but let's say 40% of the world's Jews lived in Israel. Let's say 20% lived in North Africa, 20%, you know, we were in Alexandria in Egypt. We were already a diaspora people, but the majority, the plurality, the highest concentration lived in the land of Israel. But after the Romans conquer it, Israel becomes a kind of a backwater economically. It's not a very vibrant place. And so Jews begin to migrate and to leave. And they end up going primarily to Babylonia, which is modern day Iraq and Iran, Persia, really modern day Iran, and other parts of the Middle East. And there is a very small percentage of Jews who remain in Palestine. No one knows exactly what it's called then. It's not called Palestine. It's not called Israel. Palestine comes later, but we don't quite know what it's called, but it is essentially what's modern day Israel. And it's just a very small percentage of the Jewish people. And by the way, this is common in Jewish history. Do you know in the 1820s what the largest Jewish community in America was? Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston, South Carolina was the largest Jewish community. Now, there's still a small Jewish community in Charleston, South Carolina, but it is by no means the largest Jewish community. In fact, somebody was just telling me when Hebrew Union College was established in Cincinnati in the 1870s, Cincinnati was like the 5th or 6th biggest Jewish community in the United States. Now it's like the 30th. So, things change, people move. And that same thing happened in Palestine. So Jews left. Now, at this point, Jews could have been like virtually any other nation state or people and said, we have a religion, but we don't really have a homeland. We were exiled from that homeland, so we're going to practice our religion in another place, or we'll just assimilate to whatever the religion of the local area is. And this is what happens to most people throughout history. There were many different ethnicities in the Torah. We read about them, the Jebusites, the Hittites, all this. They're gone. So why didn't that happen to the Jews? Now, a couple reasons. One is in our prayer book, in our liturgy, there are always prayers for a return to Zion, for a return to the homeland. So even if Jews were not living in Israel, it was part of the Jewish imagination, the Jewish heart. Judah Halevi, a very famous poet, said, "I am in the West, but my heart is in the East," right? That we, the idea that we would eventually go back to our homeland. That's a core part of Jewish tradition. That's sort of preserved in the prayer book. Second reason is persecution. Jews, wherever we lived, were persecuted. So in some ways, the persecution kept Judaism alive. In some ways, anti-Semitism, because Jews were never fully accepted. And in fact, in Christian areas, Jews had to suffer in order to prove, in some ways, Christian rulers had an incentive for Jews to remain Jews because their suffering could prove the truth of Christianity. So in many ways, Christians didn't want Jews to convert to Christianity. Because you think about it it's always good to have an enemy. It gives you, well, it's not always good, but if you're thinking politically, strategically, in some ways, it's good to have a common enemy because it unites your own group. So Christians had an incentive for Jews to survive and to suffer because it proved the truth of Christianity. So Judaism essentially survives because, one, we have this deep longing in our heart for Zion, and two, we continue to suffer and be persecuted. So those two go together. And then in the 19th century, something happens, as I talked about, the rise of the nation state. And there is a group of Jews who say, you know what? We are a nation state too. Our prayer book has kept alive these prayers for return to Zion. And even though the vast majority of Jews did not live in the land of Israel, there was always a small community there. There's still a small community in Charleston, South Carolina. Probably the Jewish community in Charleston, South Carolina is probably bigger than the Jewish community in Israel was in the 1600s, but it was there. There was always a small community that essentially lived off charity. There would be drives in towns and people would collect money and send it to Jews living in Israel because it was considered a mitzvah to live in Israel and to maintain that connection. So it was always a small community, but it was never a significant community. But then in the 19th century, Jews, many of whom grew up Orthodox, but they had become secular, because remember, this is a secularizing time. Many of those Jews said, we have the same right to a nation state as any other people. Germans have a nation state, French have a nation state, Italy has a nation state. Why can't we? Secondly, we will never be accepted by other peoples. Now, this is where the big controversy comes in. So on the one hand, you have people who essentially say Jews can be good Germans or good Frenchmen or good Americans, good Englishmen, and also be Jewish. That we can be part of the nationality of where we live, and we can be Jewish by religion. And in America, that has essentially worked. That formulation worked in America. It has not really worked anywhere else. And that was what that's where the controversy comes in. Because in the 19th century, you have many Reform Jews who say, we are German, we speak German, our culture is German. You know, a lot of the early Reform synagogues in America, they kept their board meeting minutes in German. They spoke German, or they were France, wherever you, and so there was this idea that actually we can be accepted by the larger society, we can integrate into the larger society, and we can remain Jewish. And that was the really early dream of Reform Judaism. And that, by the way, is why Reform Judaism succeeded magnificently in America, because that dream was possible, but never succeeded in Europe. It has a little pockets here and there, but you know, it's nothing like it is here. So that's where the controversy comes in. Well, that's one layer of the controversy. So you have some Jews who say, we will never be accepted. And because anti-Semitism is a endemic, you know, we've heard that word now, endemic, it's going to be, anti-Semitism is endemic to European society. So the only solution to anti-Semitism is a Jewish state. We will never be accepted. So if we want to survive as a people, we need our own state. If we want to have self-realization and realize our potential as a people and survive as a people, we need a state. And that's what the early Zionists believed. In fact, I talked about this on Friday night. You know, many people see Theodor Herzl as the kind of founding father of Zionism, and he was in Europe, in Western Europe, but really the beginning of Zionism in Eastern Europe happens in Ukraine, in Odessa. It's a very famous doctor named Leon Pinsker, and Leon Pinsker founded the first modern Zionist organization called Bilu, which means Ba'im Adonai, with God, Lu, we shall go forth. So literally means we shall go forth. It's an acronym. Oh no, that's the acronym. I gave you the wrong. It means Beit Yaakov Lechu V'nelcha, which means house of Jacob, let us go forth. And that's the idea that we will go forth to the promised land because we are people. We are the house of Jacob. That starts in 1881 in Odessa. And not an accidental year. That's when the first pogroms really happened. I mean, there was persecution, of course, but that's when pogroms really started to accelerate because there was an assassination of the Tsar. You know, Ukraine has never been stable, unfortunately. This is when modern Zionism begins. And many of the early Zionists, modern Zionists, they believed they actually negotiated with anti-Semites. They would say, look, you don't want Jews living in your country. We don't really want to live in your country. So help us, you know, develop the land of Israel, and then we'll get out of your hairs. You won't have to deal with us anymore. This is what Herzl did. Herzl was very bold, and he actually met with several Turkish sort of sultans, you know, who are the sultans of the Ottoman Empire, people that owned all the land in Palestine. You know, the land was sort of like, there were subsistence farmers. I mean, the Palestinians were essentially, they lived on the land, but they never owned the land. That's a whole nother issue. But the land was owned by others who didn't live there. And they said, help us, you know, claim this land, and we'll set up a country and you won't have to worry about us anymore. So this is one controversy, one source of tension. You have Jews who truly believe in positive assimilation, the idea that we can become part of the larger country and we can have reformed temples and rabbis, and we'll speak German. We can be good citizens. We can serve in the army. If you want to keep kosher, you can, but many didn't. But we can survive as citizens of other countries. And then you had a whole nother group that said, no, we can never survive that way. We have to have our own country. Some of that split down between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. In Western Europe, there was a much greater belief that we can assimilate, we can be part of the larger culture. In Eastern Europe, many Jews didn't really think that. And rightfully so, there was more persecution in Eastern Europe. There was less opportunity for Jews. So you had Eastern Europeans were always more open to Zionism than Western Europeans, which is an interesting tension. But that's not the only controversy. You might think from what I just described that this was essentially a tension between Reform Jews and secular nationalist Jews, but it's not. There's a whole nother group that opposed Zionism. And that whole other group are the Orthodox. The Orthodox. Now you think, why on earth would Orthodox oppose Zionism? There's a huge Orthodox community in Israel today, and many Orthodox Jews move to Israel or at least spend time there. That's sort of, if you are modern Orthodox today, you have many family members who live in Israel. But that's new, because when Jews were exiled from the land of Israel, when the temple was destroyed in 70 CE, the rabbis of the time, the leaders of the time, developed a theology of essentially political pacifism. And what does that mean? Well, if you've seen Fiddler on the Roof, do you have a blessing for the czar? Yes, keep the czar far away from us. And that is essentially the approach of Jewish political life for 2,000 years. Leave us alone. We'll pay our taxes. We'll stay in our communities, but leave us alone. And we won't cause trouble to you, and you don't cause trouble to us. That is essentially, until the 20th century, really, until the 19th century, that is the Jewish political philosophy. It's essentially, we don't want to get involved. Let us have our small communities. And, there are exceptions. Golden Age of Spain, you had people involved in Spanish government. There are certainly a few communities here and there where there's some change, but overall, Jews focused inward on sustaining their own communities. And that was, in many ways, that was a very good strategic move to say the only way we'll survive is by focusing inward and preserving our culture and our people. And we'll engage with the outside world as necessary, but that's not going to be our primary focus. We're not going to revolt against the Romans again. We're not going to revolt against, the Arabs. We're not going to revolt against, the Spanish throne that's imprisoning us. We'll try to survive, and we'll move around if we have to, but our goal is to survive as a people. And that philosophy shaped Orthodoxy and traditional Jewish life. So when Zionism came around, this group said, what? No, that's not our approach. Our approach is we keep our people alive. We live where we can live in as much freedom as we can, but we're going to continue to suffer because we're Jews. We're God's chosen people. We're going to have to suffer. We're never going to be able to be free of anti-Semitism. And that is too much. We are replacing God if we try to create the promised land. That's up to God. Eventually, yes, we will be restored to the land of Israel. That is our ultimate hope. But that only comes about when God wants it to come about. That's not us. Our job is to simply follow the mitzvot, to survive as a people, and go on to the next and study Torah. That is the Orthodox philosophy. And even modern Orthodox in its earliest days, that was part of the philosophy. So a guy by the name of Samson Raphael Hirsch was the founder of modern Orthodoxy. And modern Orthodoxy said, we can assimilate to German political life. We can be citizens of Germany, but we are going to maintain our Orthodox religious practices. Sure, we'll give a sermon in German, and but we're not going to stop keeping kosher. We're not going to try to. We're going to have our own schools to keep Judaism alive. But even modern Orthodoxy said we're not trying to rebuild the land of Israel. Again, that's up to God. So on one hand, Reform Jews oppose Zionism because they said, we want to assimilate. We want to become part of the larger country. We're not going to assimilate religiously, but assimilate politically. Whereas Orthodoxy opposed Zionism because they said, that's up to God. That's not up to us. So the Zionists then were mainly secular Jews who said who said anti-Semitism is endemic and we are going to have to take it into our own hands. And that tension persists throughout the 19th century. By the end of the 19th century, you have several different groups. You have proudly assimilationist Reform Jews. Now, when I say assimilationist, I'm not meaning that in a negative way. Now, many people interpret that word negatively. I'm not using it negatively. I'm using it simply to say people who believe Jews could be part of a non-Jewish country, be it France, America, England, so forth. You can be a citizen of that country and practice Judaism. That's one group. Then you have the ardent Zionists who said, we can never live in our own freedom. We can't really be free outside the land of Israel. We have to do everything we can to build up the land of Israel. Then you have a third group that says, we want to preserve Jewish tradition. We don't really want to assimilate fully, but only God can recreate the Jewish state, and we have to survive with our mitzvot and our people around the world as best we can. That's sort of the modern Orthodox position. And it's truly controversial. I mean, the only thing that some of the Orthodox and Reform agreed upon is that Zionism was terrible. You know, the first World Zionist Congress, which was held in 1897, Theodor Herzl wanted it to be held in Berlin, which made sense. Berlin is a big city. It's the New York of its day. But the Reform clergy and the Orthodox clergy in Berlin succeeded in nixing it. So then Herzl had it in Basel, Switzerland, which I'm sure is a beautiful town, but not a city where you want to inaugurate this global movement. But starting around 1880s, 1890s, you have a couple of new strands in this controversy. The first is you have modern religious Zionism. These are people who say, actually, we don't have to wait for God to start the process of rebuilding the promised land. We can start the process ourselves. And the idea was that God is giving us an opening. These secular Zionists who are trying to rebuild the land, they may not realize it, but they are answering God's call to save the Jewish people by rebuilding the homeland. And there's a few of these rabbis. One is named Yehuda Alkali, and then there's another named Rav Avraham Kook, very famous. And these were highly respected Orthodox rabbis who broke with the vast majority of other Orthodox rabbis and embraced a kind of religious Zionism. Now, they were not secular, and they believed that the Jewish state should be governed by Jewish law, but they said we can cooperate with the secular Jews who are because they are doing holy work even if they don't know it. And that part of our obligation as religious Jews, Orthodox Jews, is to follow God's imperative in this time and place. And this is the religious Zionist message. Now, this is by no means is this a majority of Orthodox Jews, even in the 1940s and 1950s. It's certainly a majority of Orthodox Jews today. You know, the only people that aren't are the sort of far right ultra Orthodox, which, you know, they get a lot of media attention, but they're really very small in number. But this is a true innovation in Jewish life to say we can be observant Jews, but we can also be politically active. So that's one strand. Another is you have certain Jews, mainly in America, who say, we want to assimilate to American culture or German culture. This happens in Germany too. But we also believe that there should be a Jewish homeland in Israel that reflects core Jewish values. Essentially, it's sort of philanthropic Zionism to say, we think there should be a refuge for Jews around the world. We don't feel like we are in exile, but many Jews do, so there should be a state that can take them. It's kind of, one of the core tenets of secular Zionism is that anyone who lives outside of Israel lives in galut. The word galut means exile. One of my professors in college, Arnie Eisen, wrote a book called Galut, which is all about how people outside of the land of Israel interpreted this word. And it's a negative word, it has a very negative connotation. And the secular Zionists say, if you do not live in Israel, you live in galut. You live in exile. You're not in your spiritual homeland. American Jews said, no, we don't buy this idea of galut. We live in a wonderful place, but we don't want to reject the idea of a Jewish state. A Jewish state can exist and it can be governed by Jewish values, but it need not be the homeland of everybody. And in fact, they said, historically, Jews have always lived in multiple places. Jews have always lived outside of the land and in the land. And so essentially then, by my logic, you have at least 5 groups now. You have the ardent secular Zionists. You have the ardent assimilationists. You have religious Zionists. You have Orthodox opponents of Zionism. And then you have the newly forming American Jews, some Reform, some conservative, some more just sort of intellectual, like Louis Brandeis, who say, we want to assimilate, but we also want a homeland. But we're not really even there very religious. So you have all of these groups that are engaged in dialogue and controversy. Okay, questions so far, and then we'll sort of navigate how those tensions resolved. Questions on the history of it? Okay, no questions. All right. Now, how does this play out? Well, the Holocaust, and this is I'm being very brief with the history here. The Holocaust and the founding of the state of Israel changed the debate significantly. So after the Holocaust, the idea of anti-Zionism really fades away. There are a few groups here and there. There's the American Council for Judaism. There are ultra-Orthodox Jews who still oppose it, but in general, most Jews around the world become supportive of a Jewish homeland. However, there's still tension. There are still the maximalists represented by David Ben-Gurion, who say essentially, if you don't live in Israel, you are in galut, you are in exile, and your obligation as a Jew is to ultimately settle in the land of Israel. And if it is totally impossible for you to settle in Israel, at least support it, at least send some money, visit when you can, do everything you can to make Israel the center of Jewish religious life, even if you can't live there. And there are actually many Reform rabbis who kind of embrace this philosophy. Even though they're serving in the United States, they say essentially our whole identity as Jews should really be centered around Israel. There was a very famous rabbi in Miami Beach. I'm sure Rabbi Sarada knew him because he was in the area when he was a kid, named Leon Kronish. And Leon Kronish's son is now a rabbi, lives in Israel. And Leon Kronish essentially said in the 1950s, our whole school curriculum is going to revolve around encouraging people to make Aliyah. Like really that this is our obligation as Jews, even though we're here. And yes, people have businesses, people have practices. We can't just uproot and leave, full scale. But if we can, we should travel there every year. If we can, buy an apartment in Israel, if you're so fortunate that you can do that, do everything you can to move closer towards living in Israel. And this actually, there's still some of that today. There are still people who believe that today. Even if, so that's one approach. The other approach is, well, we don't intend to make Aliyah, but we view Israel as an essential refuge for Jews around the world, that there is a place, a homeland that we support. And while we may not ever want to live there, we will travel there, we will support it. But part of that is we believe Israel should exemplify Jewish values. And those Jewish values are equality, liberalism, a welcoming of immigrants and other people, shalom, peace, trying to achieve peace. So you have these two groups, and this is where there's still tension today. So you have one group that is really, let's call them Israel maximalists. Now, I'm not using any of this in negative terminology. So when I say maximalist, I don't mean that negatively, just descriptively. People who really say Jewish life ultimately revolves around Israel. And even if we don't live there, we do everything we can to support that. That's sort of where AIPAC's guiding philosophy, right? I mean, AIPAC really, it's an American organization, but its donors really are sort of Israel-centric, versus a more, guess one could say left or not Israel, a more, let's call it dualistic, to say, Judaism is both a national religion and a diaspora religion, and we support a Jewish homeland. We certainly don't believe that Israel should not exist, but we believe Israel should reflect what we think of as Jewish values. And so we'll support Israel and travel there and so forth, but we're also going to try to hold Israel to account. And we're not going to say Israel right or wrong just because it's Israel. And this is where we have tension today. And it's a lot of tension. I mean, you just need to follow the news to see that. It wasn't always as tense as it is now. Essentially, probably up until maybe 20 years ago, you could kind of fit everyone in a big tent to essentially say, yeah, there are disagreements. I mean, in the history of Congregation Solel, when Arnold Jacob Wolf was the rabbi, there was an organization that he would help found. Actually, he helped found it after he left. It was when he was at Yale, but it was called Brera, which was in the 1970s. And the word Brera means choice. And this was the first group that really said there should be a Palestinian state. And that was in the 70s, which was, very, even in 1992, when I was researching this, I came across, in 1992, when Bill Clinton ran for president, he opposed the creation of a Palestinian state. There was no two-state solution. Even in 1992, we think of two-state solution as sort of as sort of the basic framework. Now, even in 1992, most American Jews did not believe in a two-state solution. They really believed that Israel is a Jewish state and Palestinians have to come to terms with that. We've sort of moved. So essentially, in some ways, the American Jewish community has moved further left in one way and further right in the other way, sort of political polarization. And whereas we used to be able to fit most people under one broad tent, now there's smaller and tighter tents. Okay, Gail.
So my question is, how do you balance the idea that, Ben-Gurion's idea that if you're a Jew, you live in Israel. Okay, that's it. And the other idea that if you're a Jew, you perform the mitzvot, or as many of them as you can, or are relevant to your life, given the fact that there's no temple sacrifice and all that. I mean, aren't those two conflicting ideas?
You mean that well, he didn't really believe in that Judaism is defined by the mitzvot. That was one thing. For Ben-Gurion, he was more of a secular Jew, in that
but today, wouldn't there be a significant number of Jews who say Judaism is about the mitzvot, not about the land, although the land could be one of the mitzvot.
Right. Well, yeah. So essentially, the theology right now of modern Orthodox Zionism is that the mitzvot are central, and the land is one of the mitzvot, but essentially that the 20th century provided a new framework for the mitzvot. That essentially, that's why that Israel was, in a way, God coming back into history. It's almost as significant a moment as Sinai, not as significant, but on a similar level, that part of our task as Jews is to settle the land. And that the Holocaust in some ways reminded us that the only way we survive as a people is if we settle the land. The 6-Day War, for many modern Orthodox Jews, the 6-Day War had almost messianic implications, that Israel's survival was threatened, and yet in 6 days, the country triples in the amount of territory it controls. That is a message from God that this is where we survive as a people. So in a way, Orthodoxy is becoming modern in that it is changing, but it's changing because it sees God acting in history. And the only reason that that's exciting, you say, well, how can it change? Because many of the most prominent rabbis said it did. Orthodoxy changes. It just changes very slowly, and it only changes. The key person that initiates that change is a rabbi named Zvi Yehuda Kook, who is the son of Avraham Kook. And Zvi Yehuda Kook said, it's very interesting. He said about 3 months before the 6-Day War, he said, God is about to send a miracle to our people. There's a sermon he gave. And then 3 months later, you have the 6-Day War. It's over in 6 days. And people said, and then Zvi Yehuda Kook said, now God is calling us to go and settle the land. So he got this credibility, and this message really spread. And people are susceptible to powerful, charismatic messages. So in some ways, Orthodoxy adapted to the fervor of nationalism. That's what I would say. Others might disagree. Okay, Sarah.
This is very interesting, the groups you defined, because I would say in the 80s and 90s, I was looking for a synagogue, and I went to some synagogues near where I was living. They were very Israel-centric.
Yeah.
Almost every sermon, they were Reformed synagogues, but almost every sermon the rabbi was addressing problems in Israel and issues with Israel. And that was not where I was at that time, and I didn't feel comfortable there. So I think how you view Israel and how it fits into your secular view is very important in Reform identity and which synagogue groups people feel comfortable in.
That's a very good point. And I think that's still true. Like where my wife is, they're probably more conservative in their view of Israel, and I'm certainly more moderate than far left. I'm definitely more moderate, but I'm not as sort of kind of far right, I would say. Again, I'm not trying to use this disparagingly, as even other Reform rabbis. And so I do think that sometimes, synagogues are shaped by the people there. I think it's less so today. Today, most Reform rabbis are pretty much in the sort of liberal camp, one could say. There are a few exceptions. But I definitely think, probably in the 80s and 90s, there were really distinctions. Those have faded away. In some ways, it's kind of sad because Israel became more right-wing in a way. That's part of the problem in many ways, that Israel for many, many years had a socialist government, essentially. Now that changed, but there has been a furthering of polarization in America. In some ways, it's a reflection of the polarization going on in Israel. So I think you're absolutely right. Different synagogues have kind of different stances and different approaches. But I think it's a little bit less so today, especially in the Reform movement. Conservative movement still does.
Well, yes, that's true. But I have a question about the Reform movement. Second question. It used to be that when the HUC was formed and they had the Treifa banquet, And they served lobster and whatever other tray of foods as kind of a saying, these are the trappings of Judaism. We're rejecting them. We're keeping the moral meat and values of Judaism without the trappings. And little bit over the years, Reform Judaism is now chanting their prayers again. HUC has a year in Israel, I believe, for the cantors and the rabbis that are being trained. So that seems like a real change, that now HUC is having a year in Israel as an experience for their
Mhm.
for the clergy that they're training.
Yeah, you're right. It has. And that's part of the reason is that in some ways, American Judaism succeeded magnificently, that we are all American. There's no, if you were born in the United States and you're not, child of immigrants, but maybe even a child of immigrants, you're generally pretty American. So the early Reform Jews, their challenge was to Americanize Jews. Now the challenge is to Judaize Americans. And so to Judaize Americans, you can have a little bit more ritual. You can spend more time in Israel. So I think that's absolutely true. It's essentially what's the challenge? What's the role of the synagogue? And it's a good thing. It's a good thing. Yeah, Sue.
Am I unmuted now?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So when I was growing up, and this was late 40s, early 50s, for some reason, I had a very negative feeling about Zionism. It didn't come from my family because my parents never spoke negatively in any way about Israel or Zionism. And I don't know where I got it, but I do recall when I was, in Sunday school and everything, and when I did go to temple on Friday night with my parents, I never remember hearing them talk about Israel.
That's interesting. Well, the 50s are an interesting time. In the 50s, historically, Israel wasn't, for a few rabbis, it was, like I mentioned, that rabbi in Miami Beach.
Mhm.
He might have, and even by that time, the Reform movement was mostly Zionist, but it wasn't fully, by all means. I mean, there were certainly, and the 50s was in general a time of greater conformity. So it kind of makes sense that in synagogues in the 50s, you would talk more about sort of religious spiritual values than political nationalist values, because, churches where people went to church to hear, spiritual values. So people went to synagogue to hear spiritual values. So I think that fit the times more. Not that there weren't exceptions, but even then, I mean, just think about the number of people who traveled to Israel. So a few people went in the 50s, but most people, didn't really travel there. I talked to my grandparents. I think they traveled there in 1963, which I think was early. A lot of people traveled after the 6-Day War. Things were opening up more, especially in the 70s. But most American Jews didn't really travel to Israel in the 50s. So I think in some ways, and remember, Israel's this little country then too, relatively poor, struggling to stay alive, getting help here and there, but even the American Jewish Alliance isn't really strong until the early 60s. So yeah, it took a little time for that kind of connection to develop, even if there were a few exceptions here and there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sarah?
Just one quick thing. When you talked about the pogroms in the 1880s with the death of the Tsar, that created a big wave that created Zionism, as you said, but also created a big wave of immigration to the U.S. A lot of Eastern European, my great grandmother, for example, came from the Baltic states in the 1890s. So there was a big wave of from what was Russia, which included the Baltic area and Poland and other adjacent states. There was a huge wave of Jewish immigration to the U.S. at that time. So Zionism was one option to come to Israel, but I think a lot of Jews viewed coming to America as a way to escape those pogroms. So that was like happening about at the same time.
If you look at immigration from Eastern Europe between about 1880 and 1920, one could say about 90% went to America, 7 or 8% went to Britain, and about 2% went to Palestine. The vast majority come to the United States. And the interesting thing, and this was true of other ethnic groups too, the Irish, the Germans, the Polish. The difference, though, is that of all those immigrants from other countries, about a third of them went back. Nobody talks about that, but it's true. Very few Jews went back. We all stayed, which makes sense. Where can we go back? What, go back to a pogrom?
Yeah.
A few people did go back because, some just, a lot to the highest majority went back to actually Germany. If you said, you had a decent life in Germany and come to America and it's uncultured, it's different than it is now. But the vast majority stayed. Good. Yeah. Gail?
I don't want to end the discussion about Zionism and the United States and the relationships and so on without going back to a controversy that was very prominent maybe 15 or 20 years ago, and that's the "Who is a Jew?" Do you remember that? Maybe that only lasted 5 or 10 years, but I remember it being a very hot issue at one point.
Yes.
That if you weren't from an Orthodox congregation or you didn't have the right paperwork, the whole business of whether or not you were entitled to live in Israel or get married and all that was very much in the forefront. Yes.
So this points to a tension that still exists today. Who determines Jewish identity? Who determines Jewish identity? And on the one hand, if Israel is a secular state, and this is let's say a Jewish secular state, which sounds like a contradiction in terms, but is actually probably close to reality. Israel is governed in many ways by Jewish values. However, you can still have an open restaurant on Shabbat. You can still drive on Shabbat. You wouldn't do it in certain areas, but it's not illegal. It's not there's not a religious police overall. The Orthodox do have rights about marriage and burial and things like that, but overall, it is a secular kind of society, but Jewish values influence it. However, you also have the law of return, which says that any Jewish person. So there's a built-in tension in Israel itself. And Israel has no constitution. So this is politically charged. One Knesset comes in and can pass a law, another Knesset can come in and change the law. It's happening right now with the Western Wall. So the "Who is a Jew?" controversy reflects this tension. On the one hand, but the "Who is a Jew?" is even more complex. On the one hand, you have Orthodox authorities in Israel who say, Israel is the Jewish state. We determine Orthodoxy is the legitimate path of Judaism. There's no such thing as Reform Judaism. They might say Reform Jews are Jews. We're not going to, someone doesn't follow Orthodoxy. We're not going to say they're not Jewish, but the theology of Reform Judaism is not a real theology. So we decide what makes a Jew, or the tradition decides, and the tradition says if you are born to a Jewish mother, you are Jewish, or if you convert in a traditional way with mikvah and study and all the traditional aspects of it, you are Jewish. But we determine that. That's one approach. The other approach, which is sort of where Israel has landed, is that we say that so long as you convert or are accepted as Jewish by a mainstream denomination, so it could be Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, we will say you are Jewish. And so it's essentially a self-determinating identity. And that is generally where Israel has landed. Like I've written many letters, well, not many, but I've written a few for people who make Aliyah to say this person is Jewish, they converted under, my auspices, or they are known to have been born to a Jewish mother. I know that, and they are in, and the Israeli civil authorities will take my word as a Reform rabbi. Now, if that person wants to then get married in Israel, it's a whole nother. I mean, my brother-in-law got married in Israel, and I had, they wouldn't accept my attestation. I had to call an Orthodox rabbi friend who attested to it, which was a pain. But in any case, that tension still exists. Yeah, Sue.
So in light of what Gail was saying about the 80s and 90s and who was a Jew, my brother got married in Israel in the late 60s and had a lot of trouble. They wouldn't accept. He got a letter from the Reform rabbi of the congregation my family belonged to. It wasn't good enough. Yeah. They wanted him to convert. I mean, it was crazy.
Right.
And I mean, eventually, I don't remember how they managed it, but he did get married there. But it was very troubling.
Yeah, it is. And I think this is a big tension in Jewish life today, because even if it doesn't pan out in all these circumstances, part of the core idea of Zionism was that it is the land for the Jews. When Theodor Herzl wrote The Jewish State, it's often translated as the Jewish state, but in German, it really means the state of the Jews. So Israel should be a place of refuge, a homeland for all Jews, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox. However, as Israel becomes, the truth is, more Orthodox move to Israel, and the Orthodox population in Israel is growing relative to the non-Orthodox population. It's still majority secular, but the number of kids within Orthodoxy, those who make Aliyah, there are not many Russian, well, there may be more now, but there are not many, Jews from the former Soviet Union who go to Israel anymore. There was for a period of time, but that's pretty much ended. And the balance of power in Israel is shifting more towards the Orthodox. It's a long-term thing, but it is. And so then what happens as more people experience that feeling of alienation? And it's already happening. So what happens to the Jewish state when it does not appeal or does not feel a connection to the majority of non-Orthodox Jews who live outside of the state? Now, again, there are ways to combat that. I mean, Birthright Israel is an attempt, and it's been fairly successful, to connect non-Orthodox Jews and diaspora Jews to Israel. But that success is sort of fighting against longer term trends. And I worry about it. Because in many ways, Israel is important to us, but it doesn't really it doesn't really affect our day-to-day lives in the same way that it does for many Orthodox who have family there. If we have family there, that's wonderful, and it does. But for many American Jews, it doesn't. And so we're kind of becoming further apart. And if we become further apart, what does that do to Judaism? And in some ways, the who is a Jew debate kind of reflects that. Who decides who's Jewish? In some ways, this is political. Does the Jewish population in Israel decide? Or does the Jewish population in America decide? Does the Orthodox decide, or do the non-Orthodox decide? Because they're sort of two very different communities. And I see that tension growing. I'm not sure quite how we address it. We're certainly not at a breaking point yet. And maybe we are able to overcome that. But I think all the tension we see today among Jews with regards to Israel it reflects that growing fissure. And a lot of it comes down really to politics. I will never forget, it's a very monumental moment. We were in Israel. I was in Israel for my first year of rabbinical school. And we had the mayor of Jerusalem come and speak to the students. I used to see him working out next door. I used to work out at the hotel next door, and I would see him there too. So he comes to the class, and he gives a great talk. It was Ehud Omer, who then became prime minister, then went to prison. But we're in Illinois, we're used to that. But he comes to prime minister, he went to prison. And anyways, somebody asked him, why don't Reform Jews have more rights in Israel? Why can we not, be recognized? At that point, there were no recognized Reform rabbis. Now there are a few. Why can't we pray at the Western Wall? And he's just said, you know what? If you move to Israel and you bring more people, you'll get those rights. But right now you don't have anybody here, so you don't have the rights. And it was very straightforward. It was very political. And I think that is kind of the challenge that Israel, if the population doesn't reflect our Jewish values, and it may not ever, in many ways, we've formed an American Judaism that was essential to Israel's founding, but in some ways, Israel's becoming different. I hope it stays similar to where we are now. I mean, I love that. I love the closeness, but there are many historical trends that are kind of working against that. Okay, I want to continue this next week too, because there's a lot more to discuss. Sarah, final comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask you about what you said about why the Jews survived. I heard an interesting lecture about klezmer music by an ethnomusicologist, Yale Strom. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. Anyway, he said there's 3 elements to culture and how it survives: language, food, and music.
We got that.
And Eastern Europeans had that.
Yeah.
And when the state of Israel was formed and the Orthodox were an important power group, a small power group, but were important in making the coalition, in the original coalition in the state of Israel, they were given certain concessions. And that's why there's kind of a theocracy in terms of marriage and divorce and certain rules. As I understand it, that's why,
you're
why
exactly
those
right.
Things
David
evolved.
Ben Gurion was brilliant and one of the great leaders of world history. If you ever travel to Israel, go to his house. He had an extraordinary library. He was very well read, but he was really wrong on one big thing. And what he was wrong about is he believed Orthodoxy was dead. So he believed that the Orthodox would not survive, that they weren't modern. And when the state of Israel was founded, there were only about 500 ultra-Orthodox Jews who would be exempt from army service. So he said, okay, if they want to be exempt, no big deal. There's only 500 of them. We don't need them. They'd be bad soldiers anyways. So fine, exempt the ultra-Orthodox. He just made a bad miscalculation.
But I think also because of so many people being killed in the Holocaust, that element of European Jewish culture was disappearing.
Yes.
And so Israel was a place where that could kind of be almost in a museum, could be kept alive and go forward. And part of the reason to choose Hebrew as the national language was to keep that language alive.
Yes.
So I think, as American Jews, we may be evolving a different culture. American Jewish food is not the same as Jewish food in Israel, for example.
That's right.
It's kind of like Eastern European deli type food. So in a way, in terms of language, culture, and music, American Jews are now differentiating a bit from Israeli Jews.
Very good point. Yeah. And so then so in some ways there should be a reverse birthright. Israeli Jews should, and it does kind of happen in some ways. The challenge though, the real challenge is, can we survive? Can we survive as a group? We may not. We may just assimilate. I God willing, hope we do. And I think we probably will, but it's a lot harder to survive that way when you're not a majority. And, but yeah, you're absolutely right. We have developed our own culture, and still Israel, it's still that more Jews live in America than live in Israel. I think it's coming close to parity now. But I still think there's a little bit more. So we're still kind of the center of Jewish life, but that's shifting. And what I want to talk about, we'll continue this next week because this is very interesting. One of the key differences in Israel is that the more right-wing politicians like Bibi Netanyahu have essentially made the judgment that non-Orthodox Judaism is going to die. And so it's better to ally with the Orthodox and with evangelicals. Whereas, other parts of Israel have said, are much closer to non-Orthodox Judaism. So essentially, part of the tension in world Jewry plays itself out in Israeli politics. So wonderful. I wish all of you a wonderful week, and I'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very, very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It was good.
Thank you.